Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dan, the voice behind ThatKaitoDan, and welcome at last to my full review for RWBY Volume 5. Yeah, sorry this is taking so long to get out. I took a few weeks off after the finale just to let things settle in my mind before I had a deeper dive on the volume as a whole. Unfortunately, I also had a seriously bad string of sick spells, and I had some more important personal matters that I had to focus on offline first. But those are all done now, and I am finally here to give you guys my opinion on the volume as a whole, and I thank you guys so much for being patient with me and getting this video out. Hopefully it is going to be worth the wait. But before we get into the review properly, here are a few of your viewer comments from the end of Volume 5. We're starting off with Wallow Vicky, who didn't consider it their favourite finale of the series, but a solid one all the same. Whilst Renegade Spark echoed my thoughts on the episode, feeling like it needed the previous one to get the best result. And Riley Plays agrees on that part 2 concept, on top of sharing some love for the Yang and Raven scene. Thank you all by the way for your comments this volume, it's been a ton of fun seeing all of your guys' thoughts. And I appreciate every single one of you who watched the video, left a comment, and gave me some love. Now, I must stress that this review is just my opinion, and it's all for the sake of friendly critique, as with any of my episodic reviews. You may agree or disagree with my opinions, but please don't consider any negatives that I share to be me bashing the show or the hardworking, amazing talent behind the scenes, as I do want the series that I hold dear to my heart to keep improving. Nothing is perfect, nor free from criticism. Also, it should go without saying, but please don't watch this video if you haven't kept up to date with the show itself. Spoilers are a thing, people. Look lively. Now, Volume 4 was a decent recovery period for many of its cast, and it gave us the breather that we sorely needed at that time, during more character-focused developments. But Volume 5 was tasked to pick up the pace and welcome back the major narrative. The prospect of another Kingdom's fall sparked up excitement and dread in the community, and many were hoping to see a possible Team RWBY reunion usher in enough highs to make up for some of the lows during the group's breakup. So, what's my overall reception to these events and the show's 5th season in general? Let's find out, starting with no doubt the big Goliath in the room: the story. The splintered main 4 up until this point has given the crewbie the challenge of trying to juggle multiple scenarios in not a lot of time, and even though it's not been the best storytelling structure that the series has had, I am happy to say that I felt the screen time balance was stronger this time out. Volume 5 had just the 3 arcs of focus that would then blend into the big one at the end, compared to Volume 4, which tried to manage 5 across different settings and tones, which led to several arcs not getting enough time for completely rewarding viewing. But with the expanded episode count, filtered story chain, and fixed endpoint, I didn't feel that issue with any arc in Volume 5. I think it's funny that Haven had the relic of knowledge instead of choice in hindsight, as I found each arc had its moments where choice is the main motif, not just in regarding decisions made in the past and present, but also the ramifications that can follow, resulting in some very solid emotion-packed scenarios and much needed and welcomed character growth. I like it when there's a sense of theming through a season, and while it's got its hiccups, the exploration of choice related to the cast was a sound approach. Going into detail now on each plot point, starting with Menagerie, Ilya is probably the standout character this volume, after exploring her plight. A series of events best described as a roller coaster of emotions, complete with the confirmed lesbian crushes and attempted murder of said crush's family. So, you know, fun times for all. Though seriously, it was quite intense at several points, and I loved it. After a brief hint to it in Volume 4, we got a better look at the Chameleon Girl's conflictions, and by the end of it, we got one of the most tragic and heartfelt characters in the show. I totally understood why Ilya would hate humanity, and there is some truth to her outcries. But she also questioned the morality of the group's actions and wondered if what she was doing is really the best for her people and for herself, which goes a long way in creating this well-rounded character and showing off how not all White Fang members are gonna be monsters or mindless pawns. A welcome insight for this particular faction. With every twist and turn, I was hooked seeing Ilya clash with her old friend. And for the show to make me care this much about a relatively fresh character and their possible descent over just a handful of episodes definitely deserves due praise. Plus, it went a long way in helping Blake's character grow. Backed by her own progress from last volume and with more welcome support from Sun, Blake achieved a strong statement of defiance against Adam and fought back against concerns over if she can really make a difference. By making up for where she failed her friend in the past and showing there's always a chance to do what is right without violence or running away, Blake is slowly overcoming her demons, and it's so rewarding to witness this growth over the years to this moment. She needed this personal victory, and Blake standing tall at the end with her former friend and her people beside her is a rewarding step in the right direction. However, this plot point did contain episode 9's very poor follow-up to the hype building setup leading into the Belladonna family attack, which at least was the thrilling jolt of energy that the volume needed. And while I did enjoy the pair's interaction with Ilya and their threat as corruptive manipulators, the Albanes ended up being quite underdeveloped. The reasoning for their poisonous cultist mind games and their allegiance to Adam not really being all that explored, and it looks to be staying that way following their respective outcomes. But what hurt this arc the most for me was the events on Adam's side of things. It started off good, as Adam finally caused a stir in the story beyond his hate boner for Blake, with overtaking the White Fang. But it also led to a wasted character in Sienna, who had one of the best designs in the show, and was a unique figure in the Faunus conflict that got axed off far too quickly, and far too easily as well. We also didn't see enough difference in how Adam runs the White Fang under his warped beliefs compared to Sienna's morally grey stance, before he was seen as a weak leader to his followers at Blake's hands. Don't get me wrong, it was super rewarding seeing Blake get the better of her tormentor when she needs all the confidence she can get to accept that no longer running away is the right choice. But it runs the risk of losing some menace in the Renegade if Blake has already bested him in combat with relative ease despite his newly gained power. And it did put a damper on an otherwise enjoyable conclusion to the events in the Faunus Haven. Hopefully the proposed new Faunus Brotherhood and Adam's rage at being belittled means that battles in the future between the two sides will continue to challenge the pair in more effective and satisfying ways. Now from one half of the Bumblebee pair to the other, Yang's arc was a lot more active than her last venture. But even on the road, this arc still carried on the great exploration of her recovery and maturity, as we see the blonde go from rock bottom to a more hardened and focused person. Though she still has her warmer and jovial nature intact, which is good news for sure. We've seen plenty of examples that moving forward, Yang is adapting well to her lessons, especially when it comes to the questioning of the truth and not letting her emotions get the better of her, though she doesn't always succeed in either of them, which thankfully shows she's got some way to go, and it's not going to be a flawless, sudden improvement. The long-awaited reunion with Raven actually being less about Yang's hunt for answers on the Runaway's actions, but more so on using her mother to get to RWBY, was actually a very cool misdirection that tied in well to one big side of the blonde that I love: her willingness to be there for her loved ones no matter what. Yang pushing herself to keep cool despite her high-strung emotions made for an effective visual contrast between these two in what they'll do for others. Doubly so when we add in the insight that we now have on Raven. we finally got our chance to see that there is actually more than one mask that Raven hides behind. While Raven's distrust of Ozpin and fears over Salem may be well founded, I was surprised seeing how far she would go to hide her insecurities through lies and bravado, whereas Yang would grow to embrace her concerns yet press forward. It actually makes Raven a lot more human and vulnerable, and I fully welcome that. She's complex and flawed, which is much more interesting than someone who has no flaws, yet her survival instinct and tactical cunning is still quite sharp, and she's still a badass woman that you do not want to cross, as shown with her very entertaining butting of heads at multiple points with Cinder. It doesn't excuse for some of her weak-witted attempts to win over Yang midway through the volume, mind you. Raven was the best person to see some differing viewpoints on the larger conflict and those involved that would make Raven's point of view hold more water. But so much of what she said to Yang and Weiss was already common knowledge to us, and nothing that would truly cause the pair to jump ship right then and there, which was a shame after it was starting to be built up as this big truth and a different angle in the larger story. It could have been so much more rewarding if the writers allowed for a little bit of outside clarity on the pair of Grandmasters and their actions, but it's clear that that's going to be fed to us in slow doses and only with some sense of doubt to its validity. At least the heated stare-downs between Yang and Raven was where we got some much needed venting and exploration between the mother and the daughter and their relationship. Compare the two's emotional states in the tent to how they acted in the vault, and you can tell that progress has been made in stripping down Raven to her fragile core whilst elevating Yang into a brave soul who will choose to accept her fears. A perfect outcome for the Spitfire considering the state that she was in not too long ago, and a promising humanization for the Bandit. It's a narrative chain that I just can't help but admire in its successful developments. Also, Raven being the true Spring Maiden was a remarkably well done surprise. Another memorable moment that added to Raven's desperation and warped logic as well. But there's also some leftover questions related to Vernal and why she was so willing to be a scapegoat for Raven that, again, we are unlikely to get answered anytime soon. I did at least enjoy her role as a red herring and somewhat rival to Weiss. That scene in the vault was also one of the two most wonderfully written scenes in this volume that involved Yang, the other being the long overdue Freezerburn chat with Weiss, who was a surprising but overall fantastic addition to Yang's narrative, being the rock that kept her on a steady balance when her emotions over Raven and Blake were starting to break Yang down. We needed more of these two together in the series, and I'm super chuffed to see it lead to a moment like this, that showed how Weiss was grown up into a more mature, caring individual despite her chaotic life, as well as finally letting Yang open up over her woes over Blake. It was unquestionably the highlight of the volume for the Ice Queen, besides some colourful moments amongst her friends, and some exciting action pieces. And while she did handle herself well on her own for the most part after escaping Atlas, maybe we could have done with a bit more of Weiss trying to stand on her own 2 feet alone before the reunions to truly test her mettle. But even then, when captured by Raven, it was clear how well she steeled herself, whereas before, you would imagine that the snooty Weiss would probably be less than successful. But let's talk about that Haven arc, and this is where a lot of the volume's holes are kinda hard to ignore. Even so, I will applaud a few things. The reunions, they were all fantastic, well-crafted moments that tugged at my heart and made me smile. They were so well utilized at just the right moments in the story, and everything from the presentation to the performances for these scenes was excellent. Next up, Oscar is a fine addition to the group who has some cute chemistry with Crow and RWBY, and I'm excited for more on his growing efforts to become a protector rather than a bystander. And while the writing hasn't always been the strongest overall, trust me, I'll get to that soon, The character writing has been some of the show's best, regardless of it being comedic, emotional, or just simple socializing. Even scenes that didn't offer up much to the overall plot still provided plenty of much needed charm and entertainment. The writers do a pitch-perfect job of breathing life into the many characters, whatever the tone or scenario. But on the downside, Team Ranger was pretty much benched for about 3/4 of the volume, which put a huge pause on this arc, when we should be seeing the kids accomplish tasks to win the upcoming battle, the biggest fight since Beacon. What we got instead was some admittedly great character moments, but not a lot that addressed the efforts to protecting Haven, outside of Crow scouting, the very brief training session, and of course, the exposition. Ah yes, the info dumps. So before I dive deeper on this, to say nothing great came out of these moments would be very silly to say, as we did gain welcome knowledge. Oz being the wizard is confirmed. That's a big nugget of info to ponder on. So too is the reincarnation aspect and how that could shape Oscar's future. Not to mention Yang's newly demand clarity out of Ozpin helped further her arc with Raven and grounded Ozpin to an even level with the students, and thus made him feel more like a part of the group and not just the wise leader. But man, was it a struggle to get through her points. This is where one of RWBY's biggest struggles is slap bang in the middle of the stage with its pants down for all to see. The lack of show don't tell. And it's sadly not even limited to just the Haven events. Several scenes across this volume could have done with more interesting direction, instead of a lot of it being characters in one place just talking. Sometimes the viewer needs that visual boost to help them experience what's being shared with more emotion or intrigue, rather than just having the details told to you flat out with nothing visually interesting to support it. Especially when it's either vital information that requires your fullest attention, or common knowledge that needs a different character's feelings to add a new viewpoint. For example, any of the info dumps with Team Ranger could have profited from a different setting or stylized visuals like the God Brothers reveal to avoid another info dump taking place in the same room, and thus losing some of that visual interest. Blake's chat about Ilya with Sun was visually fine amongst the colourful poor backdrop, but with a lot of the information being repeated from the Blake character short, perhaps this time we could have seen a flashback to those early days in the White Fang, so we could see how close Blake and Ilya were as it happened, and as a result would make us all the more invested and hopeful that Blake can succeed in saving her friend, because we saw the happier Ilya compared to who she is now. That show don't tell element feels the most absent in this volume than any other beforehand, and it led to the middle section, where most of these dialogue heavy scenes took place, losing a lot of the momentum and good form that the volume had already gained. It's here where I'll also share my disappointment at the wasted potential of Mistral as a setting that could have easily have aided that previous complaint. Other than the 2D images at the start of the volume, all we ever got of this place was just the school and the home base, and I see no reason why we couldn't have had the group explore this new location, immerse themselves amongst the culture, maybe even check in on familiar faces like the rest of Sun's team or Team Auburn. Anything that could have made me generally care about the city as much as I did for Beacon and Vale. There's also the fact that if you hadn't seen the World of Remnant episode that focused on Mistral, you may have missed out on the fact that this place was the culture capital of Remnant, or the home for the world's biggest black market. Sure, Crow touched on it briefly at the volume's opener, but we never saw those elements in action. Maybe we'll see something more to this capital's culture before we head off for Atlas, but it seems unlikely. I just pray this doesn't become the norm when the world of Remnant is just as much a character as the people who live in it, and it's one element of this show that I continuously want more and more knowledge on. Adding to the static nature of the Ranger events is certain characters not discussing key topics with the returning Ozpin now that he's a focal member of the group. Couldn't we have done with, say, Jean wanting to talk about Pyrrha and the events in the vault? God knows the wounded paladin didn't really do much until the ambush and his much welcome debut of his semblance. So why not let us see him try and get answers or vent his pain like he did with Crow, only this time with the one that actually led to Pyrrha's involvement with the maidens. Sadly though, the biggest missed opportunity in this area involves RWBY. It's not been a good volume for the Reaper. Though saying that, there was that heartwarming moment with Oscar, which was a rare chance to see RWBY drop her defenses and talk about her wounds that Penny and Pyrrha's death left on her, and it makes sense that she carries that silently while maintaining a brave face. But she didn't really have much impact on the volume, and there's a lot that she could have done to fix that. She was rather ineffective in the final fight despite her efforts to improve her hand-to-hand skills. Her moment of anger in said fight didn't really go anywhere. She didn't get the relic. RWBY didn't even take on Cinder despite their respective anger towards each other, and nor did she factor in Cinder's supposed death. Yes, the show is named after the team, but she is the main character. Yet it's RWBY's teammates that are getting the development and are playing a key role. The worst of her stumbles being the lack of discussion over the silver eyes. Not once did she bring it up to Ozpin, despite him being the best source of information on hand on that topic. And without that insight, I feel RWBY's not being allowed to grow, and it's also making RWBY come off as lacking urgency, despite her role as inspiration to keep on fighting. This power should be something that RWBY is driven to understand and control. She should be begging Ozpin for anything that can help her avoid losing more innocence. And that's not even going into asking on any information on how her mother may have played a role in the past. But that lack of urgency is crippling the show's main character from aiding to the story, leading to a situation where you could say even some of her enemies are developing more than the leading lady. Speaking of the bad guys, I appreciated the continued negatives of Adam and Cinder's ego and self-serving motivations. Again, more cracks in the armor, just like with Raven, and it makes these characters more interesting, and it provided some entertaining scenarios to boot. I was surprised though at how quickly Cinder's focus went from RWBY to Jean. Seeing Jean lash out at Cinder was still a heartbreaking and nerve-wracking moment, don't get me wrong, and it led to his much needed next chapter of growth. But when it was the Vixen's desire to get back at RWBY that influenced the reworked plan, it felt like it was a plot point that was brought up just to create the massive battle and nothing much else. I'm still of the mindset that Cinder is alive, and I'd like for her return to be safe for as long as possible. But looking back on what led to her own downfall, that missed opportunity with the one who caused her as much grief as she has to RWBY was a disappointing element to miss out on. At the very least, I am hoping for this shocker of a moment to boost up Mercury and Emerald, who I was glad to see back in the spotlight just a little bit more, and hopefully that will continue. I know some people were disappointed as well in Hazel's backstory being the classic vengeance for a loved one's death, but I think it's fine enough. It's at least something that drives Hazel on a personal level against Ozpin beyond any ties that he shares with Salem, and thus helping him stand out amongst the crowd, along with his hulked out form. Though of course, who's to say that we know everything about that past incident? Once was definitely entertaining himself, but it's clear that he's being saved for the Atlas events. And while Leo was a satisfying character to watch fall into his cowardly descent, I'm sad to find myself saying again that I would have liked some insight on his past and what led to his decision making before he got axed off. It's the third time I'm saying that after the Albanes and Vernal, so there's obviously a problem that needs to be addressed here. Character motivations are always a key part of someone's actions, no matter how long they last in a show. And honestly, I would appreciate their motives being explored while they're still on our minds, even though it may not matter too much. Even then, they are making notable marks in the story, and I want this insight now rather than later. Finally, when it comes to Salem, I'm still desperate to explore what makes her such a dangerous entity beyond her malicious scheming. Though her chilling cut down of Leo was at least something in terms of seeing her coldness on display. I doubt even with Cinder's death that she will come out of the shadows yet, but I think it's time that someone actually tries to touch on what led to this whole mess in the first place. Or at the very least, we need to see why Salem is a terror that kept Ozpin on the ropes for so long. We're 5 volumes in now, and it's about time that we see more on the big bad and her cryptic origins and powers. Oh, and please tone it down on those cliffhangers, guys. Sometimes an episode can be merited on its own events without having to tease the next chapter as much as this volume did. So, the story side of volume 5 isn't perfect. The exposition was thick to the point of choking without the best visual aid. Certain characters definitely needed more fleshing out or stuff to do, and plot points were dropped or underutilized as quick as they were introduced. That being said, we still got some of the show's strongest character interactions, fantastic shifts in major and personal arcs, and scenes packed to the brim with emotion and well executed writing. The narrative did well enough to stick the landing as much as it could, but it was a troublesome mix of the series' biggest flaws, which I pray gets thinned out in the future, as I'm sure the writers are painfully aware of where they can improve, which should be aided with the RWBY lot back together as one, so the juggling of multiple scenarios should be a thing of the past. On the audio front, the OST was sublime once again, for all situations and emotions, not even just including the vocal stuff. Even the lack of music at points worked to the show's directive favour. The impacts, for example, in the vault worked much better with the scene having no music at all until the attention turned to the relic, which used gentle yet eerie instruments to serenade Yang and the viewer despite the strangeness of this whole event. What was a surprise, however, was the lack of any vocal tracks outside of the killer opening theme, the Triumph, until the last few episodes. Though I am okay with this, as vocal songs should really only be used when it's to the scene's benefit, and not just added in for the sake of having some vocal songs. So if it meant waiting longer than expected, I am content with this approach, especially when the songs still had that incredible quality that is often found in Jeff and Casey's work. My personal favourite being All Things Must Die, a blood-pumping tune for the highly energized fight in the vault. And my god, was the acting in this volume utterly brilliant. I've been really impressed over the years with how many of the in-house talent have nailed what it is that's being asked of them as performers, and doing so with believability and weight to each scene, and that statement rang true once again in this volume, even matching the quality of the very impressive outsourced actors and actresses who delivered their own brand of quality, especially the likes of Jeremy Lee, Aaron Dismuke, and Damon Mills. Barbara Dunkelman and Anna Hullum are the well-deserved MVPs for that vault scene alone, giving us performances of a lifetime that amplified that moment into one of the show's finest segments. Overall, the acting is just flat out some of the best that we have witnessed from the many men and women in this cast, so massive props to every single one of them. Visually, the series continues to improve to no surprise, and I now feel very settled on this new style that the show has since the switch to Maya last volume, following at least a little period of adjustment. Outside of the action, characters move with plenty of fluidity and life to them, and facial animations never looked better, bringing in another layer of emotive character to a scene. Compared to the extremely stiff facial expressions of the past, it's gratifying to see how far this aspect alone has grown to the point of doing wonders for supporting scenes that needed that extra oomph to nail a character's feelings. Colours and details popped for the various atmospheres and settings, amongst some brilliant and wonderful lighting touches, and characters truly feel immersed now in their surroundings. The particle effects in the Cinder Raven fight might be a bit much for some, but overall, they too fit into the other visuals to great effect. I also love some of the new designs that we got, not just in the characters, but some of the locations as well, like the rustic Just Right pit stop, the murky lower class village in Mistral, and everything involving that lush yet mystical vault and its treasure room. Plus, I applaud the stronger work that is done on large crowds, even with the odd repeating design elements dotted around. The action, however, ranges from very good to problematic. Not counting the character shorts, by the way, which may be some of the show's best on their own merits. I rather enjoyed the Lancer chase for a different spin, no pun intended, on action in the series, and both it and Yang's tussle with the bandits worked as showcases for new techniques and exploring Yang's first shown efforts to composing her emotions after a fight. Plus, you can't really go wrong with getting more gunchucks, and it made for a tiny but awesome sequence on the back of another fantastic character driven bout with Blake and Ilya. And the vault fight, that was truly remarkable. It was hard hitting and bombastic, something truly different to the norm, which works given that it's two hostile maidens using powers that has never really been seen before in this world, and they're battling it out for life and death. Easily one of the better fights in the post-Monty era. But most of the action was saved for the final few episodes in Haven, and it resulted in a bit of a clusterfuck of lackluster momentum, fights happening off screen, and inconsistent locations, to name some of the complaints, even with plus points scattered around. The pace in several fights didn't match the intensity of the conflict, and Show Don't Tell returns again as fights that carried a lot of emotional baggage like Yang vs Mercury and Ruby vs Emerald kept cutting away, or barely got any focus, which was such a downer given the weight behind them, and this being such a pivotal battle. To be kind, this is the first time that we had such a fight structure like this in the series, and we still had some fun sequences, like the stuff with Oscar and Nora just wrecking Hazel. This is the first time we had good guys and bad guys all in one same general area and having a big old rumble. But when you've got a lot of personal grudges, high stakes, and such an open setting like Haven's Hall, there should be a better roadmap of which camera angle to use to avoid inaccurate locations, and a better balance of which fights get the focus, especially when there's a lot of emotions tied to them. Hopefully the RWBY can take this first swing at a large scale battle to heart and learn from it, but it's a shame that all these issues came at the same time and during the volume's finale, coupled with the long wait for the action itself, and it did go some way in leaving the volume with a bit of an unfulfilled aura about it. Overall, it's fair to say that Volume 5 isn't without some due complaints in several departments. But despite the holes in the writing, the mismanagement of battles, and characters desperate for something more, I won't say this is the show's worst, just a season that perhaps had far too many steps backwards. The show's heart is still beating strong, after a spell of captivating progress in certain character arcs, magnificent work done visually and audibly, and despite the narrative hiccups, the writing's positives should not be forgotten either. The volume does sadly carry many of the show's weakest elements amongst those positives, but as the recent Q&A seems to hint, the RWBY are on task to try and make up for where the series has gone wrong. Of course, I'm sure you guys are going to ask me at some point, so I'll answer it now. Where does this volume rank among the others? Well, again, this is just my opinion, but as of this moment, I'll rank it like this, with Volume 5 just sitting below Volume 2, which was another season that had its fair share of flaws and highlights for its cast and the main narrative. I just enjoyed that season's events more frequently, compared to Volume 5, where that dip in momentum during the middle did lose some points. If I can describe this volume in one short phrase, it would be a middle-of-the-road season, so it feels the most fitting in my eyes for Volume 5 to be wrestling for a spot in the center of the pack. And so, another volume comes to a close. Was it a triumph like the intro song suggested? Sad to say, not exactly. Yet while I am sad in where the show's 5th volume took a wrong turn on the back of a very solid entry beforehand, I still think we're on the right path, and to brush aside any of the volume's accomplishments would be very stupid. The RWBY have shown in the past that they can continue to improve and excel where they have previously suffered, so even in the many drawbacks that we witnessed this time out, I am hoping it won't be long until these bumps in the road get fixed. RWBY can be a bit of a wild ride at times, but I still wouldn't trade it for anything else, and I'll keep my head up high to where the series can still grow. Volume 5 did stumble a lot, but it still has plenty for me to look back on with a smile. So fingers crossed that it can pick itself back up, learn from its mistakes, and just like RWBY, Weiss, Blake, Yang and the rest, maybe they can grow stronger for the newest chapter of this grand story. And that's the review. Again, I am super sorry it took longer than planned. Hopefully you did still enjoy it, and you are more than welcome to share your thoughts as well in the comments down below. Are there areas you agree with me on in the review, or do you have your own positives and negatives to share? And also let me know how I can improve, it would mean a great deal to me. Also, while you comment away, please hit the subscribe and bell buttons to make sure you get every new video from me as they drop, and follow me on Twitter at ThatKaitoDan for more on all things RWBY, as well as updates on future content from yours truly, and more. Until next time, have a good day, good night, and peace out.